were you on Yom Kippur, 1973? 40 years ago today, Israel was forced into one of the most challenging periods of her existence, the Yom Kippur War. Hardly an Israeli forgets where he or she was when the sirens began to blare. Do you remember the feeling that you had sitting in shul that day? And if, like me, you weren't yet born or old enough to remember, how do you imagine it would have felt? In Jewish communities around the world, there was a collective feeling of vulnerability that Yom Kippur. As the news of the attack trickled into synagogues, many felt an urgency to come together. The war was devastating for Israel. In the 18 days of fighting, Israel lost 2,656 soldiers. And it brought about a shift in the emotions of the nation from a post-Six-Day War feeling of invincibility to a new sense of vulnerability. It was no coincidence that in 1973, Israel's enemies chose to attack on Yom Kippur. They knew that this was the most vulnerable day for the Jewish people. They understood that many soldiers would be at home with their families or in shul, and that the Israeli bases would be thinly staffed. The Egyptian and Syrian armies were not the first to try to attack Jews on holy days, when they knew resistance would be limited. In the time of the Maccabees, the Syrian Greeks attacked Jews on Shabbat, knowing they would not raise their weapons against them on the Sabbath. The Maccabees, realizing what a vulnerable position that put them in, made an enactment that Jews could fight on Shabbat in self-defense. From the Maccabees to the commanders of the IDF and many others in between, Jewish leaders have made brave decisions to keep those perceived vulnerabilities from becoming the downfall of our people. As Jews, we know that there is great strength in coming together when we feel vulnerable. All throughout our history, we have reached out to support one another in difficult times. I learned that in 1973, when the Yom Kippur War broke out, Jews in Vancouver came together. In fact, I learned that there was a family that mortgaged their house to help send money to Israel. Yet when vulnerability is felt on an individual level, it's not in our human nature to share it with others. All too often, we hide from feeling vulnerable, as it's frequently depicted as a sign of weakness. We have some sort of cultural allergy to acknowledging our vulnerability in our society that holds stoicism as a virtue. We see a glimpse of this behavior in Torah when Joseph and his brothers were reunited in Egypt. Do you remember the scene? After all of the tsuris that they went through, his brothers threw him in a pit, sold him to slavery, lied about his death to their father. And then Joseph went to Egypt. He was enslaved, thrown in prison, and finally rises to this high position, and his brothers show up, begging for food, not knowing that the powerful man before them was their brother. Joseph held so much power, he could have responded in any number of ways to his brothers, with anger, dismissiveness, maybe a big hug of recognition. But Joseph became so emotionally affected by his brothers that he sent everyone away so that he could cry alone. I remember as a teenager playing on a summer baseball team when a teammate was hit by a pitch. His father came rushing over to see if he was all right, and when he saw that he was physically intact, he looked into his son's tearful eyes and said sternly, "There is no crying here." The boy got up and ran behind the dugout to hide. That scene has stayed with me 20 years later. I'm sure it has stayed deep inside that boy as well. Vulnerability is a hard thing to face because really it's about confronting our own sense of shame. Many of us live unconsciously with a constant response to shame. It determines how we dress, how we engage with people in the office or the classroom, how we present ourselves on social media. There are many who believe that Facebook is detrimental to mental health. Because so many people present a picture-perfect version of their lives online. Their smiling children, beautiful vacation shots, delicious-looking food. That we know through our hearts that these pictures are just a snapshot of a friend's complicated life. They can easily lead us to feelings of inadequacy and shame. Dr. Brené Brown, no relation, is the expert of our day on the topic of vulnerability. Her book, titled Daring Greatly, focuses on the need to experience vulnerability as a positive experience in our lives, rather than negative. For most of us, she says, vulnerability means uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. But vulnerability at its core is the center of meaningful human experience. What most of us fail to understand, she explains, is that vulnerability is the cradle of the emotions and experiences that we crave. Vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It is the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. If we want greater clarity in our purpose or deeper and more meaningful spiritual lives, vulnerability is the path. Dr. Brown discovered something odd while researching her book. She asked her patients for a list of all the things that made them feel most vulnerable. At first, they answered in the obvious ways, citing things like sickness, loss of a loved one, loss of a job, a divorce. But when she pushed harder, this is what they reported. I feel vulnerable standing over my sleeping child, loving my job, spending time with my parents, going into remission, and falling in love. What about you? What do you think about your greatest points of vulnerability? The meaningful, positive vulnerability. What comes to mind? Today, of all days on Yom Kippur, I would like to add to Brené Brown's list another moment of significant vulnerability: seeking and accepting forgiveness. Forgiveness is by its very nature a vulnerable experience for both the person who is asking and the one who is offering forgiveness. Teshuvah is especially hard because it involves not only ourselves, but someone else as well. When we attempt to make teshuvah, we become vulnerable and expose ourselves. What if the other person doesn't respond to my overtures? What if I make teshuvah and am taken advantage of or stepped on? According to one of the greatest Jewish thinkers of the 20th century, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, teshuvah is an opportunity to liberate oneself from the failures of the past and demonstrate that the laws of psychological determinism need not control human destiny. Teshuvah is a process, therefore, of self-renewal and self-creation that comes about as a result of reflection and a resolution to effect real change in one's life. Brené Brown gives us the charge of making ourselves vulnerable so that we are able to take emotional risks with each other. She contends that when we hear other people confess their vulnerabilities, we find them to be courageous. When we confess to our own vulnerabilities, we feel weak. She asks us to see the capacity for vulnerability as an expression of courage and strength in ourselves. When we own our own stories and share our stories with one another, we know we are not alone. If we know that we all will experience vulnerable moments in this new year, we should know we have a lot in common with those seated around us. The capacity we have to connect, to share a moment, to reassure one another that we are not alone. These are opportunities to strengthen one another. We crave these moments. We need these moments. We have to be careful, because if we're not, we will set up barriers to connection. We are so unnerved by vulnerability, so fearful of the exposure and risk, that our response is not usually to reach out, but to work harder, ever harder, to make it appear as that we are doing just fine. We need to fight those tendencies to build those walls and let our vulnerabilities be at home in our lives. There's a Hasidic story of a holy Rebbe who went out on a journey and forgot to lock the door to his house. While he was away, a crowd of demons entered and took over the dwelling. When the Rebbe returned and opened the door, the demons rushed at him, ready to devour him. The Rebbe slammed the door shut and prayed. Then he took a deep breath and opened the door again. At once the demons pounced, but as they reached for him, he took down his defenses, bowed low, and acknowledged their presence. An amazing thing happened. Half the demons disappeared, but the biggest and the strongest were left, and they leapt at the Rebbe. He reached out to them and offered them hospitality. Could he give them a drink, a meal perhaps? At this, the rest of the demons disappeared, except for one. This demon was huge and very fierce. It was not going to be deterred. It opened its jaws, showing the sharpest of teeth. And as it came close, the Rebbe surrendered, put his head right inside the demon's mouth. At this point, the demon disappeared, and the Rebbe had his house back. On Yom Kippur, we come forward and put our heads into the jaws of our fear and vulnerability. We fast, we refrain from pleasure, and consider our conduct. We acknowledge our habitual avoidance of that which makes us afraid, and we see the connection between the avoidance of shame and hurting other people and ourselves. Right now, we are in the throes of this whole thing. We are hungry and uncomfortable. Maybe you have a headache because you didn't get your coffee. We do all of this not out of some strange tradition of Jewish cruelty, but because we need to strip down that in which we hide. We are exposed. What will we see? Faced with a situation that makes us stare at the depth and extent of our vulnerability, most of us want to flee. Here then is Judaism's message. You want to serve God? Run toward the very people and places you want to run away from. So much good is tied to vulnerability. Our challenge for this year is to embrace it. Be open, take risks with your heart, embrace mistakes, let yourself love deeper, laugh harder. If you do, you'll be more present, more available, more engaged with the people around you, with yourself, and with God. We open the High Holy Day season with Naomi chanting the Hineni prayer on Erev Rosh Hashanah. It is the ultimate prayer of vulnerability. May we all keep its ancient words in mind as we continue to face ourselves today, on this day of vulnerability. Kol tzarot v'ra'ut hafach lanu u'lechol Yisrael, l'sason u'lesimcha, l'chaim u'leshalom. That through our fears and affliction, we find joy, life, and peace. Ken yehi ratzon. May it be God's will.
The meditation service begins at 1:30. We welcome